The cold gray waters of the North Sea looked calm that afternoon in May 1916. Nothing about the horizon suggested that the largest naval battle of the First World War was about to unfold, yet beneath that quiet surface, two of the most powerful fleets ever assembled were already moving toward each other. The British Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral John Jellicoe, was the pride of the Royal Navy. Dozens of battleships, battlecruisers, cruisers, and destroyers forming a force so massive that the British believed no navy on Earth could challenge it. But the Germans had a different plan. They knew they could not defeat the entire British fleet in one massive battle. Instead, they intended to lure part of it into a trap and destroy it piece by piece. At the center of that trap stood Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper, commander of Germany's fast and deadly battlecruiser squadron. His ships were among the most powerful in the world. Sleek, heavily armed giants capable of firing enormous shells over miles of open water. Hipper understood his role perfectly. His job was to provoke. To tempt, to make the British chase him straight toward the waiting guns of the German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Reinhard Scheer. If everything worked exactly as planned, the British would rush forward, thinking they had found a vulnerable enemy, only to discover too late that they had sailed directly into the jaws of the German Navy. On the British side, the man destined to take the bait was Admiral David Beatty. Beatty commanded the British battlecruiser fleet, fast ships designed for speed and firepower rather than heavy protection. Beatty was aggressive, confident, and known for his willingness to attack without hesitation. He believed strongly in striking the enemy quickly and decisively, and many officers admired his bold style. But boldness at sea could sometimes turn into recklessness, especially when facing an enemy who had carefully prepared the battlefield. Early on May 31st, British scouting cruisers reported something unusual on the horizon. German ships had been sighted. At first the reports seemed unclear, distant silhouettes, columns of smoke, glimpses through the mist. But soon the message became certain. Hipper's battlecruisers were out there, and they were moving north. For Beatty, the decision came instantly. This was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. The German battlecruisers had finally come out to fight. If he could catch them quickly, he might destroy them before the rest of the German fleet could intervene. Beatty ordered his ships to increase speed. Massive turbines roared to life as the British battlecruisers surged forward across the North Sea. Towers of smoke trailed behind them as they pushed faster and faster toward the enemy. Ahead of them, Hipper saw the British approach exactly as expected. Through binoculars on the bridge of his flagship, the German admiral watched the distant shapes of Beatty's ships growing larger. He knew what the British were thinking. They believed they had found a chance for an easy victory. But Hipper had no intention of giving them one. Calmly, he ordered his ships to turn south, not to flee in panic, but to lead the British exactly where the German command wanted them. The trap had begun to close. The distance between the two forces slowly shrank as the afternoon progressed. Both sides were racing across the sea at incredible speed, battlecruisers cutting through the waves like steel predators. Sailors rushed to battle stations. Ammunition was prepared. Guns were loaded. The air inside the ships grew tense as every man understood that the first shots of a massive naval battle were only minutes away. At 3:48 in the afternoon, the silence of the North Sea shattered. One of Hipper's battlecruisers fired the opening salvo. Moments later, the British guns answered. Across the gray water, enormous shells screamed through the sky, each one weighing nearly a ton. When they struck the sea, they erupted into towering pillars of water. When they struck steel, the results were catastrophic. The Battle of Jutland had begun, and within minutes it became clear that something was going terribly wrong for the British. The German gunners were firing with deadly accuracy. Hipper's ships had trained carefully for exactly this moment. Their range-finding equipment was precise, their crews disciplined, and their shells began landing dangerously close to the British ships almost immediately. Beatty's battlecruisers fired back with massive broadsides, but their aim was less consistent. Salvos splashed wide or fell short, while German shells crept closer and closer to their targets. Then, disaster struck. A massive explosion tore through one of Beatty's battlecruisers, HMS Indefatigable. A German shell had pierced the ship's armor and reached a magazine full of ammunition. In a fraction of a second, the entire interior detonated. The ship split apart in a violent fireball that could be seen for miles across the sea. When the smoke cleared, the massive battlecruiser was gone, along with more than 1,000 sailors. For a moment, shock spread through the British fleet. Beatty stared across the water at the burning wreckage. Only minutes into the battle, and already one of his most powerful ships had vanished. Yet the chase continued. Hipper's ships kept retreating southward, drawing the British farther and farther into open water. Beatty believed he was pressing a wounded enemy. But what he did not yet realize was that every mile he traveled brought him closer to the main German fleet, waiting beyond the Hoe. Rising behind Hipper, Admiral Scheer's high seas fleet was already advancing. 16 German battleships, supported by cruisers and destroyers, were moving north, straight toward the pursuing British ships. If Beatty continued the chase, he would soon find himself facing not just Hipper's battlecruisers, but the full strength of the German Navy. And by the time he realized the danger, it might already be too late. The battlecruisers continued their deadly race across the cold waters of the North Sea. Thick smoke poured from their funnels as engines pushed the ships to their absolute limits. On the horizon, the silhouettes of Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper's German ships remained just ahead of Admiral David Beatty's pursuing fleet. The Germans were retreating, but not in panic. Every turn, every change, of course, was deliberate. Hipper was guiding the British exactly where he wanted them. Across the British fleet, the tension inside the ships was intense. Massive guns thundered again and again, shaking the steel hulls each time they fired. Sailors rushed shells and powder charges up from deep inside the magazines. Officers shouted corrections as rangefinders tried desperately to calculate the distance to the German ships weaving through the haze. The North Sea had become a battlefield of smoke, flame, and towering columns of water as shells crashed down around both fleets. Despite the chaos, Hipper's gunners continued to demonstrate extraordinary precision. Their fire control systems worked with frightening efficiency. German shells began landing closer and closer to the British battlecruisers, straddling them with terrifying accuracy. One of Beatty's most powerful ships, HMS Queen Mary, suddenly became the center of attention. German gunners had found their range. Shells began crashing dangerously close to the British battlecruiser. Huge explosions erupted against the sea around her hull, sending enormous walls of water over her deck. The ship fired back with all her massive guns, but the German fire was relentless. Then, without warning, a shell penetrated the ship's defenses. For a brief moment, nothing seemed to happen, and then the ocean itself seemed to explode. A colossal flash burst from the center of Queen Mary, followed by a violent detonation that ripped the ship apart. The blast shot a tower of flame hundreds of feet into the air. Pieces of steel, guns, and burning debris were hurled across the water. Within seconds, the proud battlecruiser, one of the most powerful ships in the Royal Navy, had been destroyed. More than 1,200 sailors vanished with her. Nearby British ships watched in horror as the explosion faded and only wreckage remained floating on the waves. Admiral Beatty stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the disaster unfold. In less than half an hour, 2 of his battlecruisers had been destroyed in catastrophic magazine explosions. The losses were staggering, and the battle had barely begun. Beatty reportedly turned to one of his officers and said quietly, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." But the truth was more complicated. British battlecruisers had been designed for speed and firepower, often sacrificing armor protection. To increase their rate of fire, ammunition handling procedures had become dangerously relaxed. Safety doors inside the ships were sometimes left open during combat, so shells could be moved faster to the guns. When German shells pierced the armor and reached the ammunition passages, the results were catastrophic. The British ships were powerful, but they were also vulnerable. Still, Beatty refused to abandon the chase. Ahead of him, Hipper's ships continued to run south, occasionally turning just enough to fire their rear guns before slipping away again into the smoke. To Beatty, it looked like a wounded enemy trying desperately to escape. The British battlecruisers increased their speed even further, pushing their engines to the edge of mechanical failure as they tried to close the distance. But far beyond the smoke and gunfire, something enormous was approaching. The German high seas fleet, Admiral Reinhard Scheer's powerful battleships, were steaming north at full speed. One by one, the massive dreadnoughts moved through the gray sea in perfect formation. Each carried enormous guns capable of firing shells heavier than small automobiles. Together, they formed a wall of steel that no fleet could easily challenge. Scheer had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hipper's battlecruisers were pulling the British directly toward him, and Beatty had no idea. The distance between the pursuing British ships and the approaching German fleet continued to shrink with every passing minute. The North Sea was becoming crowded with warships, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and battleships converging toward the same patch of water. Soon the horizon itself would begin to fill with enemy ships. Soon Beatty would realize that the small German squadron he thought he was chasing was only the bait, and that the trap was about to close. The men inside the British ships could not yet see what was coming, but within minutes, the entire German high seas fleet would rise out of the mist directly in front of them, and the hunters would suddenly discover they had become the hunted. For nearly an hour, Admiral David Beatty's battlecruisers had been racing south across the North Sea, locked in a brutal long-range duel with Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper's German ships. The thunder of heavy guns echoed endlessly across the water. Smoke from exploding shells mixed with the thick black clouds pouring from the funnels of the racing warships. But visibility was growing worse with every passing minute. But Beatty still believed he was chasing a retreating enemy. Ahead of him, Hipper's battlecruisers continued to withdraw in perfect order. Occasionally they would turn slightly, unleash a devastating salvo, and then resume their course southward. It looked like a fighting retreat, dangerous but manageable. Yet something about the situation was beginning to feel strange. The German ships were not slowing down. They were not scattering. They were not showing signs of panic. Instead, they seemed strangely calm, almost disciplined in the way they continued drawing the British farther away from their own fleet. Then shortly after 4:30 in the afternoon, the first warning signs appeared. British lookouts peering through binoculars suddenly reported new shapes on the southern horizon. At first, the silhouettes were faint, dark shadows emerging slowly through the mist and smoke of battle. But as the distance closed, the shapes became unmistakable. Battleships. Many of them. One after another, enormous warships began appearing across the horizon. Their heavy turrets and thick armor made them instantly recognizable as German dreadnoughts, the powerful core of the German high seas fleet. The truth struck Beatty almost instantly. He had not been chasing a fleeing enemy. He had been chasing bait. The entire German battle fleet was directly ahead of him. 16 powerful battleships were now steaming north in perfect formation under the command of Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Their massive guns slowly turned toward the approaching British battlecruisers. Suddenly, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Beatty's ships, already damaged and missing 2 battlecruisers, were now facing the combined strength of Hipper's squadron and Scheer's entire battle fleet. If he continued south for even a few more minutes, his ships rolled directly into a deadly crossfire. The trap had fully closed. For a brief moment, the British admiral stood silently on the bridge of his flagship, HMS Lion, staring through his binoculars at the terrifying sight unfolding ahead of him. The horizon was filled with enemy ships, massive dreadnoughts, stretched across the sea like a wall of steel, their guns already beginning to fire. Towering splashes erupted near the British ships as enormous shells crashed into the water around them. The German fleet had opened fire. Beatty knew exactly what would happen if he stayed on this course. His battlecruisers would be annihilated. Without hesitation, he issued the order that would become one of the most famous maneuvers of the entire battle: turn north. Instantly, signal flags rose across the British ships. One by one, the battlecruisers began swinging around, their bows cutting through the waves as they reversed direction at full speed. The chase had suddenly become a retreat, but this retreat was not panic. Beatty understood something the Germans did not yet realize. Behind him, far to the north, was the most powerful naval force on Earth, Admiral John Jellicoe's Grand Fleet. 24 British battleships were already steaming south to join the battle. If Beatty could draw the German fleet toward them, the situation would reverse completely. The hunter might become the hunted. As the British battlecruisers turned and raced northward, the German fleet began pursuing them. Scheer believed he had finally caught a large portion of the British Navy, isolated and vulnerable. This was exactly the kind of battle Germany had been hoping for. German battleships accelerated, their heavy guns continuing to fire as they chased the retreating British ships. Shells roared across the sky, exploding dangerously close to Beatty's fleet as they fled north. The distance between the two forces was now shrinking rapidly. Behind Beatty, the British Grand Fleet was approaching. Ahead of Scheer, the trap he believed he had sprung was about to become something very different. Both sides were unknowingly steering toward the largest battleship confrontation in the history of naval warfare. Within the next hour, nearly 250 warships would converge in the same stretch of ocean. And when Admiral Jellicoe finally deployed the Grand Fleet across the German line, the entire horizon would erupt in gunfire. The Battle of Jutland was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and neither side yet understood how close they were to total destruction. The moment Admiral David Beatty ordered his ships to turn north, the entire battle changed direction. Only minutes earlier, the British battlecruisers had been racing toward the enemy with aggressive confidence. Now they were fleeing at full speed, massive engines straining as the ships pushed through the rough waters of the North Sea. But this was not a desperate escape. It was a calculated move. Beatty knew that somewhere beyond the northern horizon, Admiral John Jellicoe and the full British Grand Fleet were already approaching. If Beatty could lead the German fleet straight toward them, the Royal Navy would suddenly hold the advantage. So the British battlecruisers raced north. Behind them, the German fleet followed. Admiral Reinhard Scheer believed he had finally caught a large portion of the British fleet, isolated and vulnerable. The sight of Beatty's ships turning away only confirmed his confidence. To the German admiral, it looked like the British were retreating in panic after suffering heavy losses. Scheer ordered his powerful battleships to increase speed. The German high seas fleet surged forward in pursuit. Across the Gray Sea, enormous shells continued flying through the air. The distance between the two fleets was still close enough for heavy guns to reach their targets. German dreadnoughts unleashed massive broadsides toward the retreating British ships, each salvo sending enormous shells screaming across the sky. Water erupted around Beatty's battlecruisers. As the shells struck the sea, columns of water, hundreds of feet tall, crashed down around the fleeing ships. Occasionally a shell struck steel, blasting apart sections of deck or tearing through armor plating. The British ships shook violently with every near miss, yet they continued racing north at incredible speed. Inside the British ships, the atmosphere was tense but determined. Sailors rushed to repair damaged equipment while gunners continued firing their rear turrets at the pursuing German fleet. Officers constantly adjusted course and speed, trying to maintain formation while avoiding the incoming storm of shells. The situation remained extremely dangerous. If even a few more British ships were destroyed, the German fleet might catch them before they reached Jellicoe's battleships, and that would mean disaster. Meanwhile, far to the north, Admiral John Jellicoe stood aboard his flagship, HMS Iron Duke, studying reports arriving from scouting cruisers and signal ships. Jellicoe commanded the largest and most powerful fleet the world had ever seen. 24 British dreadnought battleships. 24 British dreadnought battleships moved in massive formation across the North Sea. Behind them followed armored cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, a naval force so enormous that it stretched across miles of ocean. But Jellicoe faced a difficult problem. The sea was filled with smoke and mist. Reports from scouts were incomplete and sometimes confusing. Somewhere ahead of him, the German fleet was approaching, but its exact position remained uncertain. Jellicoe had to prepare his fleet for battle without knowing precisely where the enemy would appear. At the same time, Beatty's battlecruisers were racing toward him, with the entire German fleet close behind. The two British forces were rapidly closing the distance. Back in the south, the running battle continued. Beatty's ships still exchanged fire with Hipper's battlecruisers, while Scheer's dreadnoughts thundered forward behind them. The entire German fleet was now moving north, chasing what they believed was a vulnerable British force. Neither side yet fully realized how close they were to the decisive moment. The horizon ahead of Beatty slowly began filling with new shapes. Heavy gun turrets, long lines of massive ships appearing through the haze. The British Grand Fleet had arrived. One by one, the enormous battleships of Jellicoe's fleet began emerging from the mist like steel giants rising from the sea. Their powerful guns slowly turned toward the approaching German fleet. For Beatty, the sight brought enormous relief. He had successfully led the Germans straight into the path of the most powerful navy in the world. But for Admiral Scheer, the situation was about to become a nightmare. Within minutes, he would look ahead and see something terrifying, an entire wall of British battleships stretching across the horizon. And in that moment, the hunter, who believed he had cornered his enemy, would realize he had sailed directly into a far larger trap. The largest battleship confrontation in naval history was about to begin.